Welcome to INFOCUS with Ejaz Haider. In this program, which will be aired fortnightly, we'll be discussing a range of issues. The platform for this program is the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, CESPA. A word about CESPA. It's a policy research center housed in the University of Lahore and researches contemporary security and strategic issues that affect Pakistan's internal and external security environment. The center conducts research, publish and convene conferences on security, strategic, peace and conflict issues. The center also collaborates with universities, think tanks, research institutes and eminent scholars from around the world. This program is part of that effort, and we aim to speak with national and international scholars and policy experts on a broad range of issues that have a bearing on Pakistan. This is the first program, and we hope to create an impact through the quality of our discussions. Do subscribe to the channel by clicking on the bell icon. So fold the meal trays, fasten the seat belts, and let's take off. Today we're going to kick off with a discussion about a long and heavy rain spell that has flooded large areas of Pakistan, especially in Balochistan and Sindh. But the discussion puts the situation, which has caused billions of dollars of damage to infrastructure, land, property, people and their livelihoods, into the broader problem of global warming and climate change. I have with me Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who is a professor of history at Quaid-e-Azam University and author, most recently, of Downfall, Lessons for Our Final Century. A very foreboding title, as you can possibly tell. But Ilhan, thank you for being with me on this. Give me a sense of, look, when this whole thing started, there used to be linear causality. You would have a particular industry upstream that would put effluents in the streams, and then people would start falling ill, and then, you know, there were class action suits and the rest of it. And so there was a linear causality. And that has been well established through various court injunctions across the world. But the nonlinear causality, where someone is using coal in place X, and the impact of that is on place Y, how does one determine that in terms of both jurisdiction and accountability?
Thank you, Ejaz. If you think about it this way, imagine that we are all sitting in a room and somebody is continuously turning up the heat. Now, some people will feel the effects of that heat and start to suffer consequences first. And others, depending upon their vitality, they might suffer the consequences later. So when the more vulnerable starts to suffer the consequences, then we can perhaps, if you are less vulnerable, make the case that, well, since I'm not suffering the consequences as badly, then perhaps there is no problem. But ultimately, when the heat gets high enough, everyone will suffer the consequences. More academically, of course, the link between the emission of greenhouse gases and global warming is very well established. There is a nearly complete scientific consensus on this. And as far as specific events are concerned, these are happening all over the world with greater frequency and greater intensity. So it's a bit disingenuous to then argue that, well, this specific thing is happening perhaps for other reasons, and it is not being intensified or exacerbated by the larger damage that we have done to the ecosystem.
Right. Now, I refer to your most recent book, which is a compilation of essays. You have, among other things, constantly talked about what you describe as rapaciously extractive economic approach and the idea of growth, where you have a finite planet, but you constantly depriving that planet of its resources, and in doing that, also impacting the ecology and not just the forests and all that, but also other species of worms and animals and birds and whatnot. And your essays give us a sense that we might already be very late in addressing this issue.
Well, the thing is that once a tipping point is crossed, the situation can ravel very, very quickly. And this is something that history teaches us from various political or economic examples going back into the past. But the tragedy, of course, is that until that tipping point is crossed and actually produces a violent reaction, those at the very top of the pyramid seem to be able to think that, well, we can insulate ourselves from whatever ill effects our behavior is generating. So I think that is what we are seeing now, in the sense that you have these escalating problems all over the world. Puerto Rico, for example, is being battered by hurricanes as we speak. And there doesn't seem to be much of an effective response from the United States government. So I think that general insensitivity to the effects of extraction by the people on top is something that has always characterized our political systems and our social systems. The only problem is that when you turbocharge this facet of our behavior with the economic extraction associated with modern consumerism and industrialization, the ecological consequences can easily get away from us. And that now seems to be happening at an alarming rate.
Right. You also say that, and I'm actually quoting from your book, humans are generally not good at contemplating the end. And this is essentially has to do with the kind of optimism, never losing hope being a cardinal principle of religious faiths also, modern ideologies also, and what you call, which made me chuckle, the vacuous self-help industry. Now, you also say that you call this the Pangloss effect from Voltaire's novel, Professor Pangloss in Candide. Give me a sense of why you focus on that. I mean, and I ask this because generally people say you need to be upbeat and optimistic. Are you saying that we need to not be optimistic in order for us to actually be able to understand and appreciate how close we are to the final tipping point?
I think that in Candide, what Voltaire is doing is that in a way he is showing how a false sense of optimism that is not grounded in a rational appreciation of our circumstances leads us to rationalize the problems that we are facing rather than overcoming them. And this is something which we see happening in the context of climate change. It's something that we see happening in the context of global warming, that there is an emphasis on business as usual. And in the meanwhile, the idea is being sold that, well, maybe there is some sort of a technological silver bullet that is waiting to solve all of our problems. This is also something which relates to the emphasis on individual optimism. That is to say, the idea that, if we all chip in, if we all do our bit, then the problem is going to be solved. This, of course, appeals to us at one level because it gives us a sense of agency. But when we actually look at the distribution of damage to the ecosystem, what we find is that that damage is very heavily concentrated in the hands of maybe the 75 million richest people on our planet, and in the hands of about 70 to 100 large corporations that are responsible for our current energy extraction and consumption model. So it is very good for these companies and for that top 1% to have us all thinking that, well, there is some sort of magic solution around the corner, or that if we all just, stop using plastic straws, the planet can be saved.
That's right.
So I think that is what we need to understand, that what we need at this stage is not false hope. What we need at this stage is grim determination and a willingness to make hard decisions that will necessarily inconvenience ourselves in order to have a future.
Absolutely. In fact, grim determination will also tell us, and I think this is something that we should know, there is always the collective action problem, especially where vested interests are involved and where billions and trillions of dollars are involved. But Ilhan, you also have chosen four intellectuals, scholars from the past, starting with Ibn Khaldun. Then you have Malthus, and you talk about the Malthusian correction. Then you have John Stuart Mill, who talked about a pause in terms of, and cast doubts on the idea of infinite growth. And you also then, of course, mention, and it's not just a cameo presence, it's obviously a very important presence, Charles Darwin. So give us a sense of why you chose these four scholars, polymaths, intellectuals from the past.
Here I have to confess that I basically chose them because I really enjoy reading them, and I often teach them as well. So it was more of a subjective choice, that there was no great design behind it.
No, but it's bang on, because Ibn Khaldun gives you insights into how collections move in cycles, and then Malthus talked about the geometric and arithmetic sort of progressions in terms of populations and how much food you can produce. J.S. Mill talked about this strategic pause and cast doubts over the idea of infinite growth, and Darwin also Darwinian correction. So I think it was bang on target. But let's get to where we are now. Now, we have been talking about reparations, we have been talking about, and the UN General Secretary was also here, lots of other experts were also talking about the fact that what Pakistan has witnessed and suffered is a consequence of climate change and global warming. But the idea of reparations, do you really think that that's going to work, or that's even realistic, or should we expect, or do you think that some years down the line perhaps people will begin to realize that something like this can be, in terms of accountability, can have universal jurisdiction?
No, I don't think that there are going to be any reparations for this. There were no reparations for colonialism. After the abolition of slavery, it was the former slaves that were made to compensate their former masters. So I really don't think that it is realistic to expect any kind of reparations for what has happened. And that is something which countries in the global south need to realize. And they need to assume going forward that they basically have to help each other out.
Right. So that then requires a complete rethink of how geopolitics is unfolded in this region. For instance, if we were to take the example of Pakistan and India, they will have to bury the hatchet, they'll have to have cooperative strategies, because instead of having a zero-sum, conflictual model. And I think that is something that you mention very clearly in the book also.
Well, yes, the thing is that we need to work on those threats that are actually going to make the existence of India and Pakistan impossible in another 15, 20, 30 years, maybe before then. And whatever the two countries might have in terms of political or diplomatic disputes and differences, they pale in comparison to the challenge of survival on an even plus 2 degrees Celsius planet.
Thank you. That was Dr. Ilhan Niaz speaking with me. I now have with me Dr. Iram Sattar, who teaches water security and policy, environmental law and water law and development at Tufts. Iram, thank you so much for being with me on this. This is absolutely important because the areas that are underwater are almost the size of a medium-sized European country, so it's a huge area. And we've been talking about officials, and the UN General Secretary was also here, and he also talked about it. And there are other foreign experts also who have been talking about the connection between what has happened in Pakistan and global warming and climate change. But do you really think, and I asked this question from Ilhan also, that the idea of reparations is realistic?
So I actually think, let me dive right into that. I actually think that the idea of reparation may be realistic, but the problem is that it is on a very long time scale. And we certainly do not have that kind of time. Even if you sort of build some kind of global coalition that says that, the developed historically will pay and compensate the underdeveloped because of their overuse of carbon, this could take decades. Let's draw a parallel. Think about the idea that has been going on forever about all kinds of historical injustices, including, for instance, about slavery, right? There's all kinds of moves that say, well, look, there should be reparations for slavery, there should be reparations for colonialism. So I'm a skeptic. I'm an optimistic skeptic, but I just think that the timeline for reparations is going to be not an easy problem to solve.
That's exactly what Ilhan, you talked about slavery also. He referred to colonization and he said, well, has anyone been compensated for that? Plus, the timeline that you were talking about, and Ilhan just has a book out, which I mentioned, Downfall, Lessons for a Final Century. It's a pretty foreboding title. And he argues that time is something that we do not have because A, we have crossed many lines and we are at the final tipping point. Is that an assessment that you would agree with?
I believe sincerely that there is time, but that time is very, very little. And I kid you not, I think by the 2050 mark, I think things will basically start to steamroll. They will topple in a way that we won't know how things are breaking. So I think we really have very little time. There's very good research that says that if we want to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius centigrade, a goal, we will need to halve global emissions by 2025. Now, clearly, we are nowhere near the ability to have, global emissions in the next couple of years, right?
Right.
So time is obviously of the essence, but I think we have no more than 30 years.
Well, Ilhan says 3,000 days. I didn't do a back of the envelope arithmetic to figure out how many years that would be, but here's the thing. There have been re-evaluations of the original assessments of when, for instance, the Arctic ice sheets would melt. And that, I think the original was somewhere in 2085 or something, and now they have brought it back to around 2035 or something. I don't exactly remember the years. But clearly, there is a lot that we know, but there are also lots of unknowns, given that not everything has a linear causality.
Exactly. Once unknown things start happening, how that will impact things very far away is a sector stuff we don't know. So, look, we need to invest in serious resilience that has not happened essentially for decades. Now, obviously, at the moment, everyone can easily see a flood, right? We see the scale of the devastation, the destruction. But we should be equally worried about is long-term droughts, changes in rainfall patterns, the disappearing of the glaciers, what that does to water recharge, whether it's groundwater or reservoir storage. So there's a lot of resilience that we need to be focused on building that actually deals with all kinds of uncertainty from the range from say drought to flood. And
Correct.
that's a pretty big range of options that we need to have in our toolkit.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, there is this discussion about global North and global South cooperation, but I think that's a bit optimistic. Actually, that's very optimistic. So, I want to ask you, is it possible that South can cooperate, like for instance, regions can cooperate? Let's assume we're talking about West Asia and South Asia. And if that is possible, then I get a sense that given the disaster that's staring us in the face, our entire idea of geopolitics and the zero-sum games that we have been playing in and through realpolitik will have to have a rethink. For instance, India and Pakistan, instead of competing on Siachen, will have to find cooperative strategies. Ditto for Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, right up to perhaps Myanmar. Is that something that could have some kind of impact in terms of decelerating the speed with which we are headed towards this disaster?
So I think that would require a certain amount of maturity, right? That would basically require saying that, look, let's take this crisis and where can we build cooperative solutions? That requires a lot of awareness, and it requires an assessment, that something out there is going to be worse for all of us if we don't cooperate. But again, that is hard. Even during this global pandemic,
Correct.
We have seen that there has been, vaccine hoarding, for instance, right? Or like differential access to the latest mRNA vaccine.
Correct.
So countries, whether we like it or not, we have to go through the sort of, sovereign boundaries of nations and then try and create win-win that says, look, even if you pitch it in terms of self-interest, right? Supposing you tell the global north that, look, there is going to be a migrant crisis, okay?
Right.
Because obviously people can't live where, they can't have food, houses.
Correct.
So even if you pitch it in very self-interested terms, maybe that's the way to move the discourse. That look, if you think you're going to escape all of the ramifications of these actions today, it's going to be challenging for you also. And obviously, we would like people to be more empathetic, to be able to see how people are suffering now and to act from that. But you tell me, I mean, even within the country's own boundaries right now, people are giving and cooperating, but people are also enormously disconnected.
Correct.
Supposing some government comes around right now and says, look, we are going to do a flood tax, okay, another 10 rupees is going to be added to all of your power bills over a certain amount that you use. Is there going to be serious pushback trying to get anybody, as we know, into the country into the tax net is a real challenge, right? So can we even within Pakistan start thinking in a collective way?
Absolutely. I'm happy that you talked about it because, I mean, all social scientists know about this, collective action problem. And even within smaller communities, it can be a big problem. And we'll talk about across boundaries. So it seems to me that all other things being what they are, we are unlikely to be able to address this problem, and by 2050, which I think is a fairly safe estimate, it could be much earlier than that, there will be large areas of the planet that would be uninhabitable. Now, precisely at a point when you need cooperative strategies, that kind of migrations are going to lead to new sources of conflict that will further exacerbate this problem. Is that an assessment that you would agree with?
I think they will. How could they not? If you look currently, there are districts in Pakistan, okay, where there is 40% malnutrition and hunger. If you look at the body type and shape of the people who have been affected by the flood, they are very underfed.
Yes.
Okay, what's the nutrition level of the food that they are getting? What's just their pure caloric intake? Is it adequate? So even at the moment, the disasters are basically compounding
Yes.
underlying existing stress, which only becomes worse. So at some point, right, there is a point beyond which human beings cannot function. Are we thinking of building long-term nutritional security, for instance, for people where they are? I don't think we're doing that. I don't think we're doing that seriously with seeds research, land management, water control, and all kinds of other inputs that we need to empower these people with, right? Are farmers getting the gains from what they do on a daily basis? Are Pakistanis as a whole willing or ready to afford slightly more, cost for their food
But
so that farmers can get a
here's the
fairer
thing,
share, right?
here's the
I
thing.
don't think those are true. In which case, how do people start making a living which gives them a livelihood, which allows them to, do better for their children than they have managed to do? And if we don't have that kind of justice within our food systems and our land and water systems, yes, well, people need to move to survive. As we know, migration is coping strategy 101. If
Absolutely.
you can't live where you are, you move.
You move. But here's the thing. I mean, this is without prejudice to what you're saying, because obviously what you're saying makes eminent sense. But given these extreme weather patterns, which are impacting the agriculture, and obviously with that they are impacting livelihoods of millions of people who live in the rural areas. So in terms of food security, that's going to be an additional pressure. In terms of nutrition, that's going to be an additional pressure. And then if you begin to tax people, who are you going to tax? Because if you take the liberal view of taxation, then you're not supposed to tax the rich. And so, these are problems that are compounding at a pace which is, simply, I mean, in terms of our preventive strategies, the entire thing is just simply outpacing us.
I think that a lot of, again, just standing and saying, look, we need to take a holistic perspective on this. This is a real crisis and we need to respond to it in ways that we have currently our institutions don't support.
Correct.
So there's a lot of institutional reconstruction, there is legislative reconstruction, and a capacity of people to function, okay, and how they're seeing their futures. Are they seeing it in renewable energy, sustainable food systems? Are they re-envisaging who they want to be in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And I think until we do that, yes, all of the responses are going to be just so piecemeal that they're not going to meet the challenge of the moment, which is only going to get more sort of just exponentially sort of sped up, as the century goes through.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Thank you so much for your views. I almost think, like, the various strategies, piecemeal strategies that we might ultimately get round to implementing will be akin to arranging the deck chairs while the Titanic is going down. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Iram Sattar speaking with us. Our second topic of discussion is the war in Ukraine. Now, we know that on 6 September, the Ukrainian military launched counteroffensives in the Kharkiv Oblast. Very smart move, almost masterful in the sense that everyone was expecting, including the Russians, that the main offensive will come in and around Kherson in the south. Now, we want to discuss today what here on out is going to happen, how this is going to unfold. And I have with me Matthew Bryza, a former U.S. ambassador who also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs in 2005. Ambassador Bryza, thank you for being on the program. Give me a sense of how this is likely to, because the Russians are going to retaliate, obviously. They've already started post these reverses. They've started using long-range artillery and rockets to destroy civilian and other infrastructure fairly deep now in Ukraine. So is that now going to be the strategy for the Russians?
Well, that's certainly the Russian approach. It is to use its own artillery to try to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure. And frighten or terrorize the population until the United States and others provided the longer range rocket artillery and HIMARS systems. Russia was able to follow with impunity because Ukraine could not fire back at their Russian artillery hitting it. Now that's all changed, and the HIMARS and other long-range artillery are able to strike back and neutralize some of the Russian artillery. But most important, of course, has been Ukraine's somewhat of a surprise in the, as you were saying, around Kharkiv, when in fact everybody, especially the Russian, expected that offensive to happen in the south. So from now on, it's anyone's guess as to how or whether or not the Russian military is going to be able to regroup and mount a renewed offensive. It's not just the military events on the ground that have an impact on what happens with Russia, but it's also internal politics. And seen the last week, so President Putin's most serious domestic political problems are right, including former Russian officials like the former head of the Donbass administration, or Donetsk administration, who have come out publicly and said disaster in Russia is losing, and Russia needs to not shift to a decisive approach or risk the collapse of the Russian military.
Right. You talked about HIMARS systems. Now, if the Russians are now going to strike deeper into Ukraine, I wonder if the U.S. would reevaluate its current policy of not giving those rockets with the HIMARS system, which have a range of nearly 300 kilometers, because so far they do not want to give those rockets for the systems to sort of just stay this side of poking the Russians in the eye once again. But if the Russian strategy continues, do you think there will be a rethink in Washington?
Well, I think that Washington has, well, it's stated publicly. I mean, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said, yeah, we're not going to disclose the range of missiles we're providing you, but we are operating on the basis of trust that Ukraine will not use those systems against targets inside Russia. And that approach seems to be working quite well. I haven't heard the Ukrainian government need now different things. We need more of what we are receiving as Ukraine. So I don't anticipate there being a shift in the types of or the missile systems that the United States is getting. And something to keep an eye on is, will anybody in NATO at some point provide aircraft? Because the fighter jets are depleting. And I know at least that Poland had considered fighter jets to Ukraine. And it always can do so if it wishes, regardless of what NATO makes the decision. But for now, I think the approach will remain while to provide Ukraine more of the same sorts of missiles that the United States has provided.
Absolutely. Incidentally, Ukraine has asked for more equipment, more HIMARS systems, howitzers, drones, tanks, and also APCs and other armored fighting vehicles. Thank you. That was Ambassador Matthew Bryza speaking with us. I'm now joined by Mark Sleboda, who's an international relations and security expert based in Moscow. Mark, so we now know, and of course Russia has also conceded, and I was actually looking at your tweets also and your assessment of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kharkiv Oblast. You have, of course, said that the Russians were self-limiting themselves. But give me a sense of how much of a reversal this is, because 6,000 square kilometers of territory is a large area.
Yeah, it is a large area. The population of the area in question is extremely light, and there is only one settlement of the area that has strategic significance for the primary focus of Russia's intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict from the beginning, which is liberating the full of the Donbass. However, it does have enormous propaganda value for the U.S.-backed putsch regime in Kiev, and it does have a political demonstrative effect for the people of East Ukraine that Russia cannot be certain to defend them, that the Kiev regime's neo-Nazi battalions at any moment could come back in and seize territory if Russia is not prepared to sacrifice to defend it. So that is definitely decreasing morale and the willingness of East Ukrainians to work with Russian forces.
Right. Leaving aside these value-loaded terms like neo-Nazis and the rest, because I think that's the kind of, when we talk about propaganda, it's on all sides. But give me a sense, since you've been a U.S. Navy veteran yourself, give me a sense of why the Russian planning and execution has been so sloppy, starting from the main offensive against Kyiv, which then had to be, folded up and troops redeployed into the Donbass. And since then, the original assessments of how the Ukrainians will fare against the Russian military have all been upended by the performance of the Ukrainian military.
Okay, so first of all, those aren't value-related terms. I mean, the entirety of the Western mainstream media admitted before February that the Kiev regime has literal neo-Nazi, state-armed and funded battalions. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, just 3 years ago called them a neo-Nazi state within a state. So, I mean, those aren't value-related. It's simply Western media changing the way it presents them.
Okay.
Second of all, I would not call the Russian operation sloppy at all. I think that is a lack of understanding of what Russia did, attempted to do in the beginning of the intervention. They basically did thunder runs throughout the country that was supposed to work in conjunction with Russian intelligence and Ukrainians within the country who were prepared to resist the regime. We saw in Kherson and Zaporozhye in the south, it worked extremely well. And both of those areas were quickly grabbed with almost no fighting.
Okay, Mark,
It did not
Mark,
work
let
as
me- let-
well in
let-
Kiev.
Let me intervene here. Since you talked about thunder runs, and since you are familiar with and an expert in military history, let's compare this, where the jumping off ground for the Russian main offensive was a completely friendly territory of Belarus, and compare it with the German advance, which first went through Belgium and the Netherlands, and then the blitzkrieg through France. So clearly, the fact that these thunder runs were either there was an intelligence failure, how the Ukrainians are going to react and take out these vehicles that are just running into as if they're going on a vacation, and there's not going to be any resistance, and then the failure to sustain the momentum, then the convoy getting stuck for days, presenting themselves as sitting ducks, targets to the Ukrainian drones and artillery. So I do think that, in fairness, the term sloppy is not exaggerated at all.
Thank you for sharing your opinion. I don't agree with it.
Okay, great. So when you say that you don't agree with it, are there any facts, in my opinion, that are wrong in terms of the convoy getting stuck, in terms of the inability to sustain the momentum of that advance?
Sure, the fact that all of Kherson and Zaporozhye fell in the first few weeks of the conflict with scarcely any fighting.
Right, with the Russian military saturating the ground with artillery bombing, the old Russian strategy. I agree with you there.
No, that was not how the beginning of the intervention in Kherson and Zaporozhye. That is a completely incorrect characterization of what happened in Kherson and Zaporozhye in the beginning of the conflict.
Okay, so it's interesting that while I'm talking about the original main offensive, which first got stalled and then had to be folded up, you're talking about the offensives in the east. Okay, so let's get to
south. That is the south, and they happened simultaneously.
Okay.
It was part of a larger operation. That's why it worked in the south. It didn't work in the north.
Okay.
That's all.
Yes, despite friendly jumping off ground. But here's the thing, here on out, with these reversals, what is going to be the Russian strategy? Now, let me just add that the Russian military bloggers have actually been accusing the Ministry of Defense and the Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, of being incompetent. So it does seem that as if the president is kind of distancing himself from the failure on the ground. So what is your assessment of what the Russian strategy would be now?
Okay, so I think the failure of the Russian strategy, now that they are in effect at total war with NATO arms, NATO training, NATO funding, NATO weapons, NATO intelligence, NATO operations on the battlefield, that the Russian intervention force, which has been self-limited to some 150,000 Russian troops, supported by 50,000 East Ukrainians, is too small to both hold territory and continue the offensive in the east, in the Donbass, at the same time while the Kiev regime is doing massive cannon fodder attacks all across the lines. The Russian government, I don't see it so much as a military failure as a political failure. The Kremlin needs to remove the self-imposed restraints. Russia is using 150,000 intervention force when they have 1 million troops on active duty and another 2 million of reserves.
So why are they getting the prisoners out and sending them to the front lines?
I would imagine for the same reason that the U.S.-backed Kiev regime did that months ago.
Right. So Russia is now using the Ukrainian playbook. Okay. So you talked about NATO assisted X, Y, Z, and ABC. But here's the thing. No matter how much equipment you might give to a foreign military, it needs the resolve of the people to fight back. And a good example of that is the fact that the United States and actually NATO ISAF funded the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces to the tune of about $81 billion. But that force just crumbled before the rather ragtag Taliban forces. So the actual fighting is being done by the Ukrainians. And you know, so yes, NATO is providing the equipment, latest weapon systems in fact, but in the end, it's the Ukrainians who are fighting.
Yes, on both sides of the conflict, actually. The majority of the fighting, particularly in the Donbass, where the fighting has been the heaviest, has mostly been Ukrainians fighting Ukrainians, as it has been for the last 8 years.
Right, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians fighting other Ukrainians.
Yes.
So you basically saying, before I let you go, that the Kremlin will have to rethink its strategy of self-limiting itself and put in more troops and into the theater.
Yes, I believe so, and they will also have to change their terms of engagement. And with the beginning of the quid quo pro strikes on the Kiev regime's infrastructure, I think we're beginning to see at least some indication of what that conflict would look like if Russia removed their self-imposed limitations of the so-called special military operation.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Mark Sleboda speaking with us from Moscow about the Russians self-limiting themselves. The facts on the ground are generally to the contrary, but that was his view. This is all for this episode. We shall, of course, in the next 2 weeks, be back with the second episode. But as I said earlier, do subscribe to the channel and also check out the CESPA homepage, which you'll be able to see on your screen, and the link will be below on the strip. Until the next episode, thank you so much, and it's goodbye from me.